This grammar lecture is focusing on editing, especially as we work on revising our first paper. In particular, we're going to focus on how we can check our sentences to avoid run-ons and fragments, which is very important for the revision process in terms of academic writing. So the first thing we're going to really focus on is the question of what are fragments and run-ons. So fragments, simply put, are grammatically incomplete sentences. So typically there are phrases or dependent clauses that aren't connected to their own independent clauses. So we'll take a look at really what that means, as well as common fragments that we tend to use. The reason fragments tend to occur within our writing is because we naturally speak in fragments, because if we think about conversational grammar, it is pretty often where we're not necessarily needing the context for the full sentence. Especially, say, in a conversation, if I were to ask you how you were, typically your response would be good or okay. However, that word by itself is a fragment because it's not connected to a verb. So really, the correct sentence would be I am okay, I being a subject pronoun, and am being the state of being verb. A run-on, on the other hand, is the opposite of a fragment. A run-on occurs when we have two or more independent clauses that are improperly joined. Essentially, we're combining them with the incorrect type of punctuation. The most common type of run-on sentence is what we call a comma splice run-on. So a comma splice occurs when we're combining two independent clauses with a comma instead of a semicolon or essentially a conjunction to show that relationship. So essentially, we've spliced them together incorrectly. So it's really important to edit and prevent run-ons and fragments, especially in academic writing, because of course, these are sentences that can lead to a lot of confusion. So when we correct them, we take that time to make sure we always have complete sentences, no matter what sentence type we're using. We increase the overall clarity of our sentences, our paragraphs, and as a whole, the entire essay. This also helps to reduce the chance that your reader is going to become confused or misunderstand the specific point or points you're making. And of course, as a writer, you are going to be coming across a lot more credible because of this lack of confusion, because of the consistency in terms of the clarity of each of your sentences. So when we're working on editing to prevent run-on sentences and fragments, we really want to think about what types of complete sentences there are. Because when we can recognize the different types of sentences, we know exactly what we're looking for to make sure that the sentences are punctuated properly and to make sure we're not missing one of the essentials to make an independent clause within that sentence. So we do have three different sentence types. The first one is the simple sentence. That is another word for an independent clause. So a simple sentence is one that contains a subject and a verb. It can have more information, it can have a longer predicate after that verb, but that's not necessarily necessary for the sentence, especially when we think about certain verbs that are action verbs in which you don't need to go into more detail for the audience to understand what you're saying about the subject and the verb. So, for instance, one example of a simple sentence would be, I drove. So it's two words, so it's very, very simple. But we have the subject I being the subject pronoun. We have the verb drove. And while as a reader we want more information, that's really all we need for that sentence to be complete. However, we can add on to the end of that independent or dependent clauses or phrases to add more additional information. However, that additional information is not necessary for the sentence to be complete. On the other hand, in terms of our state of being verbs, those are verbs that do require some additional information. I can't just say I am. So even though I is a subject pronoun, am is a state of being verb, it leaves that question at the end of I am what. So I would want to add on to that predicate for that to be a complete sentence. Our second sentence type is the compound sentence. So a compound sentence is made up of two simple sentences, or as I said, two independent clauses, and they're joined together. So they're joined together primarily to express a complete thought, and of course to show the relationship between those two independent clauses. We'll talk a little bit, we'll look at examples in terms of the different ways we can use that compound sentence or punctuate a compound sentence more specifically. Our last sentence type is the complex sentence. So a complex sentence is, just as it states, more complex because we do have some options in terms how we can organize it. Because what makes a complex sentence complex is while we have an independent clause, working specifically as the main clause, we also have the addition of one or more dependent clauses or phrases. So that word dependent means that in order for those dependent clauses or phrases to work, they need to piggyback off of that independent clause, that main clause, in order to make sense for the audience, in order for them to be able to work, essentially. So next we're going to take a look at a few examples of these different sentence types, just so we can refresh what that means and of course help us identify the subject and verbs in the three different scenarios. So our first sentence type example is the simple sentence. So I have two different examples of a simple sentence. The first one is, as you can see, the simplest. It's simply, today is Thursday. So looking at the sentence, it's only three words. And of course, it's pretty apparent like which one is the verb. Is the state of being verb. It's a form of that verb. So typically, if we have a state of being verb in a sentence, especially if it's at the beginning part of the sentence, that's a pretty good indicator that that is the main action of the sentence. So in most cases, the subject is right before the verb in that sentence. So today is the subject and is the state of being of today. So Thursday is answering what day it is. So that is a complete sentence because we have today is, and then we have the completer, which is Thursday. Our next example is a little bit more complex of a simple sentence. The symbol that denotes a connection to the grounding conductor is three parallel horizontal lines. So this is a much longer sentence, and as we can note, in the very beginning, there isn't a verb, right? Our first verb is denotes. So thinking of that as the verb, we would want to look at the word that comes right before to look for the subject. So the word before denotes is that. So that denotes. So that isn't a subject. That is referring to a subject. So we know that denotes is not the main verb of the sentence. So we need to continue looking. So then we have a connection, so that's a noun, to the grounding conductor. That's what we call a prepositional phrase. Then we have is, which is another state of being verb. So is the first verb that comes after denotes. And if we look at the rest of the sentence, three parallel horizontal lines, again, I don't have another verb. So this is indicating that the main verb of the sentence is. And then I need to check, okay, so what is referring to? It's not referring to conductor, because if I were to look at that, if I would isolate that part of the sentence, the grounding conductor is three parallel horizontal lines. That doesn't really make sense. So I would look further. So I want to go back to that. So what I notice here is that denotes a connection to the ground conductor. That I would consider additional information. So that is indicating and that is explaining what this symbol is doing. So the real root of the sentence is the symbol is three parallel horizontal lines. Therefore, symbol is my subject, is my verb. So looking at breaking that down, right, we really want to pay attention to this. So in most cases, Simple sentences, the verb is right after the subject in the sentence. However, when we are presenting more necessary information to make the subject more specific, this is not the case. The verb can come much later in a sentence. So we do want to be careful. We want to deconstruct and really think about how every word or every phrase in a sentence is adding meaning. Our next sentence type, we have our compound sentence. So as I mentioned earlier, there are three different ways to punctuate a compound sentence. So the first way is using a conjunction. So as I talked about in my lecture about parts of speech, a conjunction, that's where we get the fanboys. So for, and, nor, but, or, yet, or so. So thinking of those fanboys, those are the different types of relationships we can use to combine the two independent clauses. So looking at that example, I have Jesse grilled the tofu and Ben made the salad. So that comma before the and is indicating that this is a conjunction. So I'm just listing the actions and what the subjects are doing in this case. So I can take that same sentence that has that same connection and I can actually choose to punctuate it differently so that I can get a lot more sentence variety and I'm not using the conjunction and too much within my paper. So the first way I can do this is I can just use a semicolon. So what I would do is I would delete and I would turn that comma into a semicolon. So now it's just Jesse grilled the tofu, Ben made the salad. So if we notice as I read that aloud, I do have that pause, and that semicolon visually is indicating that it's the end of a thought, but that comma that's below the period within the semicolon is indicating the relationship between those two independent clauses. The last one is we can create a compound sentence by using a semicolon and a conjunctive adverb to combine it. So for instance, I would change it to Jesse grilled the tofu, meanwhile Ben made the salad. So I'm adding additional information about the relationship between these two independent clauses with that meanwhile, but I want to clarify specifically that this is still two independent sentences, which is why it's very important to keep that semicolon in this case. So it's really important to know these three different ways of using a compound sentence because, of course, it gives a lot of that variety, as I already said. And of course, in terms of this, when we do identify a compound sentence, it's also telling us that we need to check both sides of the sentence. We need to check both independent clauses to make sure that both of them are complete. So we need to make sure that Jesse grilled the tofu is a complete sentence. So we have the subject Jesse, we have the verb grilled, and we need to make sure that last part of the sentence, and Ben made the salad, is a complete sentence. So again, we have the subject. In this case, it's Ben, and then we have the verb made. So we need to check both of them as we're making sure we have a proper compound sentence. Our last sentence type is the complex sentence. As I said earlier, it is the most complex, and that is primarily because we have options in terms of where the dependent clause or phrase can come in the sentence. So if we look at this example, I have when I read the story, comma, I could imagine everything. So when is that dependent word? When I read the story, that's the dependent clause, because of course a dependent clause has a subject and a verb. However, that second example, it's the exact same sentence. I can imagine everything when I read the story. So notice in that second example, there's no comma. So this is what makes a complex sentence complex. It's not just that we have the dependent clause or phrase that needs to piggyback. It's also that our punctuation changes depending on where that dependent clause or phrase is in that sentence. So you do really want to note that when a sentence begins with a dependent clause or phrase, then there should always be a comma after it to indicate when the independent clause begins. So we know that when we have this type of sentence with a dependent clause or phrase in the beginning, we need to look for that comma and then look for the subject and verb after that comma to make sure that we do have a proper independent clause for that sentence to be a complete sentence and not a fragment. On the other hand, it's a lot easier for a complex sentence that ends with a dependent clause or phrase because, of course, when we begin a sentence with I, then that's a pretty good indicator that's the subject of the sentence. We only need to check the beginning part. We don't have to check the later part to ensure that it is a complete sentence. So moving on to checking to edit these fragments, I have a couple examples. And I really just want to break this down so it's as clear as possible because it does take practice. So we want to make sure every sentence has at least one independent clause. A good rule of thumb is that if there isn't a verb, then it is a fragment immediately. And of course, there are certain circumstances that complicate looking for a verb, which I'll talk about. We also want to make sure to check to see if the sentence begins with a dependent word, because of course, as I said in the previous slide, if the sentence begins with a dependent word, we know that we need to find that independent clause at the very end. So if we just have the dependent word and then the rest of that clause or phrase and there's no comma and there's nothing else, then that immediately is a signal to us that that is a fragment. So I have two common fragment examples here. The first one is ensuring his own survival with his extensive cache of supplies. So looking at this sentence, the only word that could potentially be a verb is ensuring. Commonly, a lot of people assume that because it begins with a verb, that means it must be a complete sentence because that must be the verb of the sentence. However, ensuring is actually a noun because when we add ing to a verb at the end, then that actually turns it into a gerund, which is a special type of noun. So therefore, it cannot be the action of the sentence. And of course, there is no state of being verb in the sentence, so it is a fragment. So really, if we think of this, we need to add an independent clause at the end, or even add an independent clause in the beginning to make it a complete sentence. Another way is we could also reword the sentence, take out the ing off of ensuring. I could specifically reword the sentence to be, using his extensive cache of supplies, he ensured his own survival. So the next example is, as many people would agree. So this is a common phrase that I see in papers all the time. And of course, it's a pretty common fragment because if we look at this, we have the root of it being people would agree. So people would agree could be an independent clause if we were to get rid of as many. However, because this sentence begins with as, that turns this into a dependent clause. So I would need to combine this with an independent clause to make this a complete sentence. I could either have that independent clause before this dependent clause, or I could have the independent clause at the end of it. One way that we could also think of this to see that it is a fragment as we're identifying it is if that sentence leaves us with a question. So if we think of the sentence, as many people would agree, it by itself, it has a big hole because it's what would they agree with? That's not answered, or even, well, why would they agree? So that is also a really good indicator that this is a fragment and we need to go into more detail by adding that independent clause at the beginning or at the end. On the other hand, when we're checking to edit run-ons, we do want to focus on some different strategies, especially because when we're thinking of run-ons, we have different causes for run-ons. Because of course, as I mentioned earlier, most run-ons are created because the sentence lacks proper punctuation. to create a compound sentence or a complex sentence. And of course, the most common type of run-on is the comma splice. So in terms of the comma splice, we know that we need to add a conjunction or a semicolon to show the relationship between the two independent clauses, or you can change the comma into a period. And we'll take a look at an example of a comma splice sentence and how we would fix that through the editing process. So another way that you can identify run-on sentences is if you're reading a sentence aloud and there isn't a pause, that can be a really good indicator that the specific sentence is lacking punctuation. So you would really want to delve into that. Typically, the longer the sentence, the more you want to be concerned that that sentence may be a run-on sentence. So looking at some examples of commonly organized run-on sentences, we have this first one that states, most of the hours I've earned towards my associate's degree do not transfer. However, I do have at least some hours the university will accept. So when I'm considering a sentence like this and I need to figure out if it's punctuated properly, and of course to make sure it's not a run-on sentence, I would listen to when I pause the longest in that sentence. So I pause the longest between transfer and however, and between however and I, because of course that's where my commas are. Commas are used as punctuation, as pauses in the sentence to create different meanings. So that's where I would pay attention. So if we think about our sentence rules for compound sentences, we're combining two independent clauses with either a conjunction, a semicolon, or a semicolon with a conjunctive adverb. So looking at these commas, I have a comma, however, comma. So I do not have a conjunction, therefore I cannot have a comma after transfer. I have the word however, which is a conjunctive adverb. Therefore, to turn this into a properly punctuated sentence, I need to change the comma after transfer into however so that it's very clear that the sentence that comes after however is its own independent clause. And however is showing the relationship between those. If I wanted to keep that comma, I would have to change however to a conjunction and delete the comma that's after however. The next example, the last example we have, is the sentence, choosing a topic for a paper can be the hardest part, but it gets a lot easier after that. So that sentence, if I look through it, I do not have any punctuation, so I don't have any pauses. So I'm looking for specific signals. So one thing to note when I'm looking at a sentence, if I want to make sure it's properly punctuated, one thing I can do is I can look for a conjunction, so one of those fanboys. So if I look here, I can see the word but. So but is one of the fanboys. So to make sure that I need to put the comma before, I want to make sure that there is a subject and a verb after the word but, after that conjunction. So looking there, I have it gets a lot easier after that. So gets is a verb that's referring to it. So I do need a comma, so I would add that comma before the word but before that conjunction. So that would turn this into a proper sentence.